Center. Julia is the project director of the Women's Justice Project within the organization. They also have a civil rights project, immigrant rights project, innocence project, and a youth justice project. They're a very busy group. Julia has worked extensively with the women at Coffee Creek Correctional Facility, the only women's prison in Oregon, just northwest of Portland. She's actually interviewed about 140 women there in a survey to get more of their story and a better understanding of what their experience is in the criminal justice system. During the pandemic, the Oregon Justice Resource Center has worked extensively to assure that the health and safety of inmates throughout Oregon are protected. The work that they do impacts us here in Central Oregon because they work on policy at the state level, and they work on what happens at correctional institutions like Deer Ridge, just an hour north of us in Madras. An interesting note about Julia is that prior to becoming an attorney, she actually had a master's in social work. Julia is from Hawaii, and she actually did all of her social work in Hawaii and moved to Oregon to attend law school. Please join me in giving a warm Central Oregon welcome to Julia Yoshimoto.
Thank you for that introduction. It's such a nice introduction and a nice picture, kind of summary of our organization. I'm really happy to be here today. I'm always excited to talk about the work that we do with more folks throughout the state and to highlight women in the criminal system. What Karen had shared with me is I'll have about 15 minutes or so just to give you a background on the work of OJRC and then the Women's Justice Project. And then I'm open to questions that you might have about our work. I'm most familiar with the work that the Women's Justice Project does, but if folks have sort of burning questions about broader issues that OJRC is working on, I'm happy to respond to those and then let you know if there are things that I have to get back to you to get more detail on things. I have a slide, so I'll try to share my screen, just that kind of goes over what OJRC is about. Karen gave a rundown of all of our projects. Let's see if I can do this. Can folks see the PowerPoint? Yeah, okay. So the Oregon Justice Resource Center started in 2011. It was actually founded by my husband, Bobin Singh, who's the executive director. And it started out as a nonprofit that was with the idea of giving law students more experiences working on criminal justice related issues. Soon after Bobbin started the nonprofit, it was very clear that there was a real space or need in Oregon for legal services or a legal program that was focused on criminal justice reform. So over the years, it has shifted from something that was largely for law students to be connected to experiences working in the criminal system to now basically a public interest law firm that also advocates for criminal justice reform. And since 2011, it has grown from Bobbin in his apartment to, I think now we have 19 staff since 2011, and we have 5 major projects. So, you know, the one that folks are most familiar with is the Oregon Innocence Project, and it advocates for people who have claims of innocence. And the Oregon Innocence Project just had its 2nd exoneration recently of an individual who was convicted in Mulhern County. And last year had its 1st exoneration of, I forget what county he was out of, but that was their 1st exoneration. In the first few years of Oregon Innocence Project, which started in 2014, they received over 500 requests for assistance. So they spend a lot of time doing background investigation before they decide to take someone on for representation for claims of innocence. Then we have our Immigrant Rights Project, which is two attorneys, immigration attorneys, that provide consultation to public defenders in Oregon for clients or defendants who are not US citizens. And so there are a lot of immigration consequences to different types of convictions. And so they advise public defenders about what those immigration consequences are going to be for their clients. We have the Youth Justice Project, which is really focused around youth who are charged and convicted in adult court. And the big sort of win for the Youth Justice Project was last year in the 2019 legislative session, where folks might be familiar with 1008, which was sort of an omnibus package of legislation that changed the way in which youth who are charged with serious offenses are treated in the adult system. So it got rid of the automatic waiver into adult court for youth charged with Measure 11 crimes. It created second looks for youth convicted in the adult system. It allowed for anyone who's convicted as a youth who's going to be serving more than 15 years to go before the parole board within 15 years to look at whether or not they are eligible or, for release. And so that was kind of a big shift in criminal justice in the way we treat minors and youth in our system. Then we have the Civil Rights Project, which has probably been the part of OJRC that's been most in the news recently. They work on civil rights issues related to the criminal justice system. So we have a lot of lawsuits around Portland police right now, or other law enforcement related to the protests and Black Lives Matter. The Civil Rights Project are the attorneys that brought the lawsuit against Department of Corrections and Governor Kate Brown related to COVID in the treatment of individuals incarcerated in Oregon state prisons around the issues of COVID. And the attorneys there just are pretty remarkable in the way that they go about advocating for individuals in the criminal system whose civil rights are at issue. And then my project is the Women's Justice Project. We got started in 2015, and it really just started with myself after a fellowship that I had coming out of law school and the fellowship was in 2014. While I was in law school, I got connected with a woman named Karma Corcoran, who's our Indian Law Program Coordinator at Lewis and Clark Law School, where I went to law school. And she was the board chair of an organization called Red Lodge Transition Services. And Red Lodge worked with Native American women who are incarcerated in Oregon and brought them religious and cultural services, as well as helping them with their transition out of prison. And what Red Lodge saw was that a lot of the women were coming out of prison with barriers to successfully reentering because of non-criminal legal issues, so civil legal issues. And the idea was, as a law student, sorry, the lighting is kind of weird. I have like the sun coming right on my face as it's going down. They were seeing that folks were facing family law issues, debt issues, landlord-tenant issues right out of prison, and that was making it hard for them to successfully reenter. And so the idea was for me to help them get screened for legal issues and then set them up with attorneys when they were released. And it was pretty clear early on that we didn't have attorneys that we could set folks up with. And so I ended up getting a fellowship so that after law school, I worked with Red Lodge on this sort of pilot program, or like sort of new idea, where I would go into Coffee Creek and work with their Native women on these issues before they got released from prison. And it was there that I began to hear more and more about the stories of women's experiences through the criminal process. And just started seeing how a lot of the ways that women experience the criminal system is because they're women, and the ways in which they are interacting with law enforcement, prosecution, the type of charges that they are getting felt very much like that's happening to them because they're women in this society, in this community, and in a system that's not set up for women. And so, you know, coming out of law school, I just assumed that there was another organization that was looking at women in the criminal system. So I felt like what I need to do is get this information to whoever that was, so that they could do something about it. There was no organization that was really looking at women's experiences through the criminal system. And Bobbin at that point was about 3 or 4 years into developing OJRC. And so we were able to get funding for me to start the Women's Justice Project, where I continue to do the individual legal services for the Red Lodge women, but also started looking at ways to educate stakeholders and the public about women's experiences through the criminal system that folks are not really thinking about. There's a lot of discussion out there around mass incarceration and criminal justice reform, but women still tend to be either overlooked or sort of like a niche kind of side discussion. And so what we've been doing over the years is trying to get women to consistently be at the table and be in the forefront of people's minds when they're talking about criminal justice reform. So Remembering is the legal services program in Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. We got funding in 2019 legislative session to expand my work into, to be able to add on 2 attorneys to pilot this reentry focused legal services program in Coffee Creek. So that's what Remembering is about. And then we have different sorts of public education components. And so every year we do a Women in Prison conference where we highlight issues that are related to women's experiences in the criminal system. Last year we did it on domestic violence survivors who commit their crimes out of abusive relationships, either at, you know, being coerced or under duress of their abusive partners, or out of self-defense. And the year before that, we did it on Measure 11 and women. It's not a population that people are really thinking about when they talk about Measure 11 reform. So we do that every year. We put out a number of reports. And then Karen mentioned the survey that we did. It was a really big endeavor that we took on with Portland State University criminology professor, Mark Lehman. And what we did was we surveyed women about their experiences, not about incarceration, but about their experiences from the time of arrest to incarceration. Like, what was that like? What was their law enforcement interaction like? What was their prosecution and pretrial like? Because when I'm working with women, I hear a lot of common trends. So the ways in which law enforcement interrogates women, the way in which they are charged for crimes where they are coerced into being in that position. And I felt like it's easy to dismiss women's experiences if it's just isolated to one story. So it's easy to say, well, that happened to her because of this particular situation and that one law enforcement investigator. But if we could get a chorus of voices and start seeing trends in what they're saying, then maybe we can start taking that to policymakers and decision makers and say, look, there is evidence here that we really need to make a change in the system so that we're treating women more fairly and more justly in our system. And so anything with Department of Corrections is a pretty big lift. It's outside of the kind of norm of how they operate. And so fortunately for us, they were willing to work with us on this, and we were able to get not as many women as we were hoping to get, or we thought we could get, but we got about 140 to 160 women to fill out the survey. It was in 2 parts. That's why the numbers just depends on like what part of the survey we're talking about. And then the professor saw, even though the numbers were not statistically significant for the population size at Coffee Creek, he felt like the numbers were big enough and the trends were big enough that we could say something about what the women said in the survey. And so those reports were written. There are 2 out so far, one on what we call survivor defendants, who are survivors of domestic violence, who participated in crimes out of that abuse. And then a report on mental health, physical health, and drug addiction, like the data that we saw around that population. And then there was supposed to be a report that came out in March, but I haven't yet been able to write it. But the next report that's going to be coming out, hopefully by the end of the year, is all the data that showed us that people do not know what is going on in their criminal cases when they're making decisions about their life and liberty. And we think that people are weighing all of these factors about their charges and sentences, but really people are thinking, if I take this plea agreement and I'm going to be sentenced for 2 years, I have nobody to care for my kids during that 2-year time period, so I'm going to take my chances at trial. And that's the way in which people, or somebody in jail told me that that they'll come back again with a better plea if I just ignore this plea offer. So I'm going to reject this plea offer and hope that they come back with a better plea offer. That people don't understand bail, they don't understand their charges, they don't understand what the consequences are going to be of what they do. And so that's hopefully the next report that's coming out shortly. So, and then the Women's Justice Project has just sort of evolved over the years, where we've gained more credibility amongst decision makers. So I'll also field calls and communications from different decision makers about ideas that they're having around women in the criminal system, and what I'm hearing from incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women about certain aspects of the system. So in a nutshell, that's what we're doing. The legal services program right now is the kind of the main component of the Women's Justice Project. But what that does, it just allows for more of us to be in very close proximity to women in the system. It's also helping us to identify non-criminal legal issues that people don't realize people in prison are struggling with, that's going to be a real barrier for them when they get released. And we all need to care about that, because we want people to be successful when they're coming out of prison. So I'm happy to take any questions on any of those things.
Yeah. And I wanted to highlight what you just said about the Women in Prison Conference, because shortly after I moved here, I was interested in mass incarceration issues. So I Googled mass incarceration in Oregon. Your organization was the first thing that popped up. Then I liked you on Facebook. And then I started getting the notice about the Women in Prison Conference. And it was there that I learned things about the Oregon prison population in the last 20 or 25 years, going from 2,500 people to about 15,000 people. And then I also learned about Measure 11s, and someone else is going to ask you about that. But I'll start with one question I was going to ask is, our group just read The New Jim Crow last month, and several months ago we read, or maybe it was a year ago, read Just Mercy. But in The New Jim Crow, people were discussing about the box, and wondering how the box is used in Oregon, because we understand that it can exclude when people have to mark on applications for either jobs, professional licenses, housing, education, public benefits, jury service, that it can impact them. And the rules are a patchwork across the country. So we wanted to hear a little bit more about what the rules are in Oregon.
Yeah, I meant to look up more details about this, but I forgot to do it. A few years ago, at least, Oregon passed legislation statewide that people can't ask about your criminal conviction on the application phase. And so there is some protections in Oregon around that question about, whether or not you've had a criminal conviction. one of the things that I used to do when we were able to go into the prison was I had an employment attorney who also worked in HR come in and meet with the women, the Native women, and talk about employment issues. And so she kind of went through there's a lot of information out there about, you know, which employers are asking for, who actually even care about their criminal records, you know, it's not an automatic thing that we shouldn't necessarily go into a job application or assuming that your criminal record is going to be a point of issue or it's something that the employer is even going to necessarily ask about. And now with the Oregon legislation, it's not something that is put on applications anymore. One of the things that I have wanted to look more closely at, but it's just such a big project, is the issue about criminal records when it comes to jobs that require certain types of licensing or certification. What I see with the women is a lot of them tend to want to go into helping professions. And those are the professions that tend to require some licensure or getting through some sort of board certification. And so there are regulations and statutes and even federal statutes that can prohibit people in certain types of occupations from where they're going to have to present before the board about their criminal record. So that is an issue, but then it's, you know, board and occupation, it's different for each of those boards. So whether it's nursing or, you know, medical technician or whatever it is, it's going to vary. So that is an issue for women.
Like it's a bit of a patchwork even within Oregon. Okay, I'll ask one more question and then I'll have Jerry come on and ask some of the questions that are in the chat. But one of the things that we learned online when we were reading the new Jim Crow was that ex-felons in Oregon could vote after completing their sentence. And some people wondered how extensive this is. Is it only after they've completely paid off their fines and court costs, or can they vote before that immediately on release?
They can vote before that. So Oregon doesn't have that restriction that you have to be off of supervision or you have to have completed all your fines and fees. They can vote after that. And so when I first started at the OJRC, it was the Women's Justice Project, and then half of my time was running a legal services program out of a reentry transition center in Multnomah County. And they would have like voter registration things available for people that came to the transition center because people can vote. A lot of people, I think, assume that they can't because of just kind of what they hear about voting and people with criminal records. But in Oregon, they can vote.
I'm going to switch over to Jerry. Jerry, can you ask some of the questions that are popping up in chat?
Yes, yeah, we got some good questions here. I wanted to ask what the population at Coffee Creek, whether it's, you know, as far as race and ethnicity, is it, are the women of color feeling they're more unfairly targeted in arrests? And
yeah, the population is in terms of racial makeup, it is disproportionately impacting women of color. It's really the data that you see in Department of Corrections on race is not necessarily accurate because it's not self-identified, and a lot of it is if somewhere in your file somebody looked at you and said you're white, then you're marked as white, even though you might identify as Native American or have been raised that way, and that's like your cultural identity. And so, you know, you can look at the numbers in DOC in terms of racial makeup will give you some idea, but when the Criminal Justice Commission did a survey at intake into Coffee Creek, maybe about 5 years ago now, it was even more disproportionate than the DOC numbers will show. And most overrepresented group are Native Americans, and then it's Black and African American. And Native Americans make up about 2% of the state population. And when Red Lodge, now it's been about maybe 6 or 7 years ago, went and actually counted the women themselves, it was more 7 to 8% of the population was identifying as Native American. So race is definitely something that is, there's an overrepresentation of people of color.
Thank you. Next question is, can you explain what Measure 11 is?
Measure 11 is a ballot measure that was passed in like 94. I think it went into effect in 95. And for certain types of crimes that are considered person crimes, there's a mandatory minimum sentence. And it's something that has been incredibly punitive for people. For one of the primary examples of that is robbery 2 is something that's considered a mandatory minimum sentence under Measure 11. Robbery 2 can look something like somebody stole something of a very low value from a store. You know, the loss prevention officer or security or somebody comes after them. The person makes contact and shoves them off. Technically, they could be charged with a robbery 2, which is a mandatory minimum sentence under Measure 11. So the part of Measure 11 that makes it incredibly punitive is not only the mandatory minimum sentence, but the way that it's used in charging. So if you have an incident, prosecution charges you with a whole list of things that are all Measure 11. You're looking at mandatory minimums. It is used as a hammer for you to get you to plead to something that you maybe otherwise would not have pled to, because if you don't plead to that, you're going to trial and you're facing all of these mandatory minimum sentences that may or may not be sentenced consecutively or concurrently. And so it's a heavy hammer, and it's too broadly used, and it creates a lot of over sentencing, I'd argue, for folks in Oregon. It is, because it's a ballot measure, in order for it to be repealed, it needs a supermajority at the state legislature. So it's one of the things that people who are familiar with the criminal system in Oregon that really want to see reform in this state, you know, always ask about, like, what about Measure 11? Where's the movement on Measure 11? I think we're shifting into a different time now. A lot has changed on criminal justice and what we think about the criminal system. Things are different around COVID issues, so maybe there's going to be more of an opening for it. But up until very recently, getting a supermajority to overturn Measure 11 is a really big lift.
Thank you. This is another one from, are you involved with mental health initiatives for women on the inside? And she mentions the group called Yoga Behind Bars. I think I've heard of that.
Yeah, so we don't do a lot of work on programs in Coffee Creek. Our focus is not on increasing the number of programs or the type of services that women get in Coffee Creek. There's just like a whole host of different programs within Coffee Creek, many of them run by volunteers or what are considered contractors, where it's not DOC staff that's doing it. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with all of the different types of programs that are available in Coffee Creek.
Thank you. I guess I can say the names of the people asking questions, since it's just us. So, Carol wants to know, are most of the women in prison there due to drug charges, domestic violence related charges?
So most are in for property crimes. Majority of the women are in for property crimes. I think it's something like 2/3 of the folks in Coffee Creek are, their most severe crime is a property crime, which are things like identity theft, unauthorized use of a motor vehicle, which can be stealing a car, those types of crimes. You know, there's not actually good information on which folks are in because domestic violence was related to the crime. It is not something that is tracked anywhere in the existing system. And with a lot of the women that I talked with who had domestic violence and felt that it contributed to their crime, it never even came up in their criminal case. So it was either something that they didn't feel like they could talk about at the time, nobody asked, they didn't know that it was relevant, or for whatever reason, it's never even tracked. And so I was just working with one woman who was in on very serious convictions, sex abuse convictions, and domestic violence was just a huge factor in the crime and the coercion and participating in that crime. And when I looked through her criminal records, the defense attorney, you know, made really good arguments, got her a lesser sentence than, you know, what the prosecution was looking for, put out a lot of, you know, mitigating factors about her background. Domestic violence doesn't show up anywhere in that criminal file. But when you talk with her, that was at the core of everything. She had been in a 10-year relationship of abuse, and it never shows up in the criminal file.
Wow. Wow. Huh. So what do you think are the biggest barriers for re-entry after incarceration for this?
Well, you know, kind of in the big buckets, I think, I would say housing is a big factor. Employment, I think kind of whatever area that is like very important and essential for all of us. You know, housing, employment, those are probably the two biggest barriers to people being successful on reentry. For women, a lot of times relationships, either with, you know, intimate partners or relationships within their own family, that can be a big factor for them and the success on reentry. And, you know, oftentimes, you know, drug addiction, untreated mental health issues, those are all also in there. But in terms of like the sort of the big core things, it'd be housing and employment.
Yeah, and you wouldn't want them returning to their domestic violence, what they had previous to getting arrested and going right back to that. That would be difficult. Let's see, what organizations in Oregon help women with a criminal record obtain employment?
Oh, I don't know. You know, all the counties are so different. I'm coming from Hawaii, which is just a much smaller state. This idea of services only kind of being county specific is not something that I'm, you know, used to. It was kind of one of the things that was more surprising to me about how separate and siloed all the counties can be about the services that are available. In Hawaii, it's by island sort of. And so it just depends on what county you're being released out to, what kind of services are available. And so the tri-counties are the ones that have the most programming. The metro area, you know, Multnomah County, Washington County, Clackamas County. It's one of the things that I think is positive about the work we're doing in Coffee Creek, which is we're working with folks that are gonna go out throughout the whole state. And so we can be a statewide resource because we're working with folks while they're incarcerated. So it just depends on what county you're going back out to. I don't know that there's a statewide service or program available.
Thank you. Let's see. This is from Marie. Is the issue of responsibility for child care used as a persuasion in offering plea deals? For example, fear of child going into state care.
It's something that I hear about anecdotally. I have to go back and see what we found out in the survey, if we can even say a lot about it with the numbers that we had. But you'll commonly hear from women, if you talk to them, about how their kids and what's going to happen to their kids or who's going to care for their kids is kind of is basically at the forefront of their mind when they're arrested and then charged and looking at you know, the consequences of those charges. And then it's not uncommon for folks to have that child welfare layer on top of the criminal convictions, and either they were in a child welfare case already and now they're looking at charges and they're either in jail or out on their own recognizance, but looking at criminal charges. You know, the way in which women in prison are forgotten about by the child welfare system is something that's just really problematic, where they have an open child welfare case, but because they're incarcerated, they're a little bit out of sight, out of mind. And so either DHS workers are not in touch with them regularly because the women can't, you know, be contacting the DHS worker regularly to get them to communicate with them about their case, or even their attorneys that are appointed to them. You know, I've worked with women where their attorney didn't know they were incarcerated, and actually this was out of Deschutes County, where the attorney didn't know that she was incarcerated. The woman had her case had already gone through a couple of hearings where she didn't appear because the attorney didn't know how to contact her, and the women didn't even know that her case had progressed the way it did, and so was at a very critical point where she was very much at risk of losing parental rights because she was incarcerated and there wasn't good communication between her and her attorney. So that's another layer regarding kids that is really problematic for women in prison.
Coffee Creek the only women's facility in Oregon?
Mm-hmm. Coffee Creek is the only prison for women. It's considered one of the newer prisons. I think it opened in 2002. The way Coffee Creek is set up is it has a minimum security unit and a medium security unit. The two units don't mix, so the women don't. They're sort of like their own institutions, where the women and whatever programs are available on medium security are for those groups, and then the folks on minimum. Right now, the number of women in prison is about 1,068, I think, or something like that. The numbers are down, and I think it's because of COVID and cases are not being prosecuted right now. It is built for 1,253 women. Back in 2017, they were in a real crisis in which there were just too many women for them to be able to function safely. So there was, I think at one point, 1,320 women in the prison. And in 2017, there was a lot of discussion at the state legislature about whether or not they were going to have to open up another unit at the men's prison to take overflow from the women's prison. And so, but since COVID, and I'm thinking it's because of the criminal cases not being processed, the women's population is down to under 1,100 right now. And just as some background, in case folks are not familiar, women are the fastest growing sort of population in the criminal system. And so, you know, they've grown, you know, mass incarceration increased the prison populations dramatically throughout the country. Women's rates at which they were being incarcerated was just multiple times greater than the men's population. In Oregon, in the last 5 years or so, the arrest rates for women have gone down by about 40%, but the incarceration rate of women over the last 20 years has basically tripled. And so there's just like a huge rise in incarceration rates for women up until recently.
Okay, let's see. Got a couple more on here. So how are the lawyers reimbursed and the center funded?
So for the Remembering program, it's through general funds from the state legislature. It goes, there's paid on salary. We're all salary paid by the legislature. It goes through the Criminal Justice Commission, and the Criminal Justice Commission regrants it to OJRC. It's a 2-year pilot, so we started it last year, at the end of last year, doing intakes, and we're funded through to June 30th of next year. But we'll be going back to the legislature next session for further funding. OJRC as a whole, I'm not sure what the breakdown is anymore in terms of, but it's foundation fundings through grants and donors. And then the Immigrant Rights Project is, that is a state funded. That's a state contract through the Office of Public Defense Services for the 2 immigration attorneys.
Okay, I'm gonna switch back to Karen now, so you can stop looking at my nose.
Julie, you mentioned the great increase of women in prison, and we know that the same thing has happened for men. One of the things that really struck us as we were reading the new Jim Crow was just how complicated and convoluted and multi-layered the laws are that have impacted the prison populations for the last 25 years. And we wanted to see what your thoughts were about decreasing prison populations, or ways to decrease prison populations, because one of the things that we noticed, in a lot of the prisons are sited in rural areas, and they're a huge contributor to the economy.
That's so sad that it's
rural areas.
That's pretty sick.
I know. So we were wondering, you know, what are things to help rural areas adjust to the loss of prison jobs, which is, you know, really, you know, there's multiple problems that we're trying to deal with.
So I don't really have a good response about how rural communities who have been able to get employment through, you know, working at prisons. I mean, I'm not sure what the answer is there in terms of how the economies in those areas and people continue to be able to, you know, have jobs. In terms of, you know, reducing the prison population, it's just going to require a huge shift by society, by the community, in what we think is normal. I think that we have all grown to just assume that incarceration is just a natural part of living in the community, as if we don't have a lot of control over it, but it's a system that was completely created by us that can be undone. There's not a relationship between incarceration and public safety. And in fact, you know, it's showing, you know, research will show that communities are not safer with the increase in mass incarceration. So, you know, a big surge, what a lot of researchers will say is that this surge in the prison population are more types of behaviors being criminalized, more behaviors racking up more charges with more punitive sentences. So it's more behaviors being criminalized, and then those behaviors, the consequences of those being more punitive. So I think we have to just, you know, it's like what we're seeing with the prisons right now in COVID-19. You know, we see throughout the country, communities and states wholly shifting the way that society operates. And we are drastically changing things. People are sheltering in place, workplaces are going remote, people are social distancing, doing things that we've never done before as a society, but there's like a collective understanding, at least in some communities, that this is what has to be done. When it comes to the prison population, we don't view it in that way at all. We are basically trying to, one, nobody's paying attention to the prison population, which I think is going to be a big problem for communities as people have to be released from prison. But we are not willing to do very much to shift the way in which prisons operate and the way we treat people in prison to keep people safe from contracting COVID like we do in the outside community. And so I think it just will take it's going to take a shift in what we think about how we treat people in this community and what we think is normal.
Julie, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the work that the OJRC is doing regarding COVID in the prisons. And you had also, when we spoke, talked a little bit about the extent to which testing is being done. And I think that would be interesting for the whole group to hear.
So what OJRC, I don't even know now when it was filed, but the Civil Rights Project for the Oregon Justice Resource Center filed a lawsuit against Department of Corrections and Governor Kate Brown, you know, sort of demanding that there be more things done to keep people in prison safe and to make it less likely that they contract COVID-19. In May of this year, they went for injunctive relief or like a temporary order in which they were hoping that the federal court, this is all in federal court, that the federal judge would order that DOC had to do certain things, that the governor had to do certain things. And really the request was, you need to release people from prison. The prison environment, it's too much of a congregate living environment. It's sort of ripe for, once COVID-19 gets into the prison, it will, you know, it's a highly contagious disease and it will infect a lot of people. And early on, Department of Corrections came forward and said, in order for them to do social distancing, 40% of the prison population would have to be released. And so what the lawsuit was asking at the end of the day was injunction or immediate relief and order by the federal judge to release people from prison based on the risk of COVID-19. We lost that. The federal judge wrote a completely different order saying that, and not requiring Department of Corrections or the governor to do anything different from what they were doing when it came to people in prison. And so OJRC is still in litigation around this issue. We have a damages component where there's the piece of the litigation that's still going is for financial compensation for folks who catch COVID while they're incarcerated. And then our attorneys are continuing to look at ways that we can be asking for specific types of orders or relief from the federal court for folks that are inside. So that's the litigation that's still going. In terms of testing, the Department of Corrections has a website. It's a COVID tracking website where if you Google Oregon Department of Corrections COVID-19 tracking, you'll see like a huge spreadsheet where they are saying how many people who are incarcerated, or no, how many people at each institution have been tested for COVID, how many are positive, how many tests were negative, how many are pending, things like that. The testing rates at the prison, I don't know what the numbers are like now, but are very, very low. Earlier this summer, you know, it was something like 2% or 4% or something of the prison population was being tested for COVID. Things have drastically changed in the last month or so, because now there are 2 prisons that have huge outbreaks right now, with over 200 something incarcerated people with testing positive for COVID. And I think at Snake River, it's like over 100 something staff are testing positive for COVID. The testing rates are still very low. If you talk to people who are incarcerated, they either are not getting testing when they're asking for it because health services is saying that they're not showing the right symptoms, or people are afraid to come forward and ask for testing because if they test positive, they're afraid that they're going to be put in segregation. And also other types of retaliation, not just segregation, but by corrections officers that for people coming forward saying that they want to get tested for COVID. So the DOC does have numbers up. I don't think that they're a very good indication of how many people should be tested for COVID. You know, Oregon is about to reach 1,000 people between staff and incarcerated folks who are positive, have tested positive for COVID. We've had 5 deaths of incarcerated people due to COVID, just 4 in August. There's, you know, the numbers keep going up at Snake River and Eastern Oregon Correctional Institution. Oregon State Penitentiary is the facility that had the first outbreak. I think in August, the top 4 workplaces with COVID outbreaks, 3 of them were Oregon prisons. And so, and folks are coming out. I mean, folks, they can't hold people longer than they're sentenced to. And so that's also another issue that was happening earlier on, is reentry transition centers were saying that they were taking in folks that weren't tested before they were released, and then coming into their transition programs and then testing positive for COVID after they had gotten there. So it's a really big public health issue right now that's just not getting a lot of attention, I think, because of just the news cycle right now. There's just so much going on.
A lot on everybody's mind. One other question I see here from Marie is, she's asking about whether there are private prisons in Oregon.
Oregon doesn't have any private prisons. They're all state, under Department of Corrections, state prisons.
One thing, we just have a few minutes left, but I'm going to switch to gallery view and wanted to see if there's any other questions that didn't end up in chat that anyone has that they want to make sure that we address before Julia has to sign off. And you can just raise your hand on your screen.
Yeah, Kim had a question. Do you want to ask your question, Kim, or do you want me to read it?
Either, doesn't matter.
Go ahead, you're on.
Oh, okay. Anyway, so go back. You mentioned that there was a survey that you did to the imprisoned population on these women to find out, you know, different things that you didn't know was going on. Can you mention a few things that you found on that survey, either ones that you thought were important or you were surprised about?
I don't know if there was anything that we were surprised about, but it was sort of confirming of the stories that we had been hearing anyway, that there were like bigger numbers in the trends for that particular population. The most glaring thing that the researcher, the professor found was intimate partner violence, and histories of trauma being contributing factors, or women feeling like they were contributing factors to their crime. That was what he did, was he looked at all of the data. The way that this survey was done, it was very long, and women sat for 1 hour to 2 hours filling out this survey. And it was, that's how long it took folks to fill it out. And so it was a lot of data. It was a lot of like yes, no questions, and then places where people could write their answers. So I can send out the links to the reports, but so what we decided to do, instead of writing one massive report that nobody's going to read with like a lot of numbers on it, we thought, what are like the big trends that we're seeing, and let's write about those trends and then give some context or discussion around those issues. And intimate partner violence and histories of trauma was the most glaring thing that he saw in the data, that women felt like that was a contributing factor for their crime. And then the other piece was the health, drug addiction, mental health, physical health, that were sort of unaddressed prior to incarceration was also a big factor in how they experienced arrest through to incarceration. So if you look at the report on the health piece of it, you know, a lot of people saying that they were high at the time of arrest, in a mental health crisis at the time of arrest. They were interrogated at high and in a mental health crisis. And so, you know, all of that information got used, you know, just different aspects of the way in which health issues contributed to how they experienced the system and what their convictions and sentences ended up being. And then there's also the piece I think that folks know more about, but you know, a lot of the women are mothers, have minor children in their care, and the ways in which that factors into how they experience arrest, interrogation, pretrial, and incarceration.
So we're at 8 o'clock now. Does anyone want to answer one more question or ask one more question before we sign off?
I can put, so I'm putting in chat the link to our Women's Justice Project webpage. And if you scroll down, you'll see the reports that have come out of our project. And included in that is the survey results that we've done so far. I'm going to be working on the next one, hopefully by the end of the year.
Well, thank you for carving out time in your really busy life and really sharing this important work that you're doing all across Oregon. It's really impacting every county. So I really appreciate your time, and I appreciate all the questions that everybody raised, because these were great questions and created a great dialogue. And I appreciate everybody's patience with our first Thursday meeting on Zoom.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Julie. Really appreciate it.
Great.
Yay. Thank you, Julie.
Bye.
Yeah,
Wonderful.